You're getting good visual here, are you? Because obviously I'm getting no feedback from it.
Yeah, we're all good, and I think we're all connected to the 4 channels. So welcome everybody. We're all, as usual, getting the tech bit sorted, as it seems to be so good so far. And obviously, as mentioned on the previous adverts and promotions online, I'm joined today by Neil Heslop on the Daily Sip, who's the CEO of Leonard Cheshire Disability. So thanks for joining me, Neil.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Martin. Thanks for asking me.
Where are you based? I know you're at home, but where are you based at the moment?
So I live in Beaconsfield in South Buckinghamshire, so about 25 minutes outside of London. But I guess I spend most of my time at the headquarters for Leonard Cheshire in London, and then round about our services in the UK. And then, of course, we have regional centres in Nairobi, Lusaka, Bangalore, and Bangkok, where we do our international work.
It's a sizable global outfit, it would be fair to say, right?
Yeah, it's a decent size organisation. We're about 5,000 staff, about 10,000 volunteers, and just this last financial year we supported about 70,000 people with disabilities with a whole range of things, both here in the UK, but also in 15 countries in Africa and Asia.
Cool. Now, back onto Leonard Cheshire in a moment. That's a great sort of framing of what's going on there in the bigger picture. But it'd be great to just kick off more about you, really, Neil. What's your backstory? And I know you've got an impairment yourself, but obviously around sort of professional as well. It'd just be great if you could share a few thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So backstory. It depends how far you want to go back. So okay, well, I'll be guided by you as to whether this is what you want. But so I was born with a degenerative disease of the retina called retinitis pigmentosa. That meant for me is that it didn't affect me in early life. However, when I was a teenager, I was diagnosed, and it only really started affecting me when I was about 15 or 16. When they told me that ultimately I would lose my sight entirely, but that was expected to happen in later life, sort of in my 40s, 50s. In actual fact, I lost a bit of sight when I was 16 and became partially sighted. And then I lost the rest of it in my first year of university when I was about 20. So I had to, switch from being a predominantly print user and learn Braille and all that malarkey. So I first year university had to pack in, go away, learn Braille, then went back, took a law degree at Newcastle, graduated in law, originally with the intention of being a lawyer. I worked in the city on a couple of internships for a bit, decided I didn't want to be a lawyer after all, and went into industry. Joined a grad scheme for a telecoms company, and that sort of started me on 25-year career in the telecoms and IT business, both here in the UK and in North America. And I guess because of my personal experience, myself and a couple of mates, one of whom was blind and one of whom was partially sighted, in the early 90s, we set up a little charity called Blind in Business, really because we felt that we were doing okay from an employment point of view, and we realised that was incredibly unusual, and we thought we should try and do our bit to help other people make the transition. So we set up Blind in Business, and I was a trustee there, for 25 years. But for most of my business career, I kept my business and my interest in disability quite sort of separate. So it was sort of, as a volunteer in my part-time, I got involved with BIB. And then about 7 years ago, I sold some businesses in the US, and I was trying to work out what to do with the next phase of my career. And like all good decisions, it was down the pub where a friend of mine just in an offhand way, well, why don't you make the hobby the day job? And the thought sort of stuck in my head, and that's given that in my business career I'd spent 25 years leading large, complicated organizations through change. I felt that there were some skills that I'd acquired that would be helpful in the charity and the disability sector. So 7 years ago, I made the switch into charity, joined RNIB. I was at RNIB for 3 years, and then got the opportunity to move to Leonard Cheshire coming up for 4 years ago. So that's me.
Brilliant. That's a perfect backstory summary. I really appreciate that. But before we get into today, both COVID-19 and sort of Leonard Cheshire, and then look to the future, just a couple of quick thoughts around when you were much more in the business sector and having the career that you had. How just some general experiences and thoughts of the sort of the barriers and challenges you had to face in that world with your impairment.
Well, I guess it's all the ones that so many of us are familiar with, for people's assumptions and perceptions. Generally people have a very clear idea what you can and can't do, and they're usually wrong. and what they believe are problems aren't, and what they assume aren't sometimes can be. So I think what I've learned, like most people with a disability, is so much of the one's progress is determined by how you engage with people, how you can create a constructive conversation and go through that process of mutual education to get to a better place, which is really easy to say and ridiculously difficult to do. And hence that's why the employment remains the great challenge for so many people.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's the usual social model barriers of environment, attitudes, and policy, and they're actually always underpinned by the attitudes that when the right people get an inclusive attitude, the rest of it just follows suit. But it's a multi-generational battle getting that simple summary to play out in actual reality. But I don't know how you feel, but I certainly feel over decades and generations there's a marked improvement in lots of different areas and industries. How do you see disability rights over the years?
Oh, I think there have been extraordinary advances. If I go back to when I was a kid making the transition, I did my degree. I graduated in '88. If you think back to then, discrimination was legal. It wasn't expressed like, but that was the reality. So I think when you had the ADA in the States in 1990, and I had an opportunity to work in the early 90s, to work with some of the civil servants and ministers who were fashioning what became the DDA. So clearly the DDA in the mid-90s was a seminal moment. If you track that through to the adoption of the UN Convention in 2006 and the UK government's ratification of it in 2009 and then the Equalities Act. So I think there have been massive advances from a legal rights point of view. And I think that philosophy has become quite strongly embedded in society. I think the challenge is that tracking those advances through to the day-to-day lives of individuals, turning that theory into reality in everyday lived experience. And I think our progress there is massively more sketchy.
Yeah, agreed. Just so you know, Neil, there's been a few people just commenting sort of good morning and morning guys and good morning gents. I mean, it's actually after midday, so I might contest whether it's now morning or not, but a few people are commenting. We have not got a question yet, so everyone watching, do feel free to get your questions in, and particularly on LinkedIn, I'll keep an eye on my phone as they don't appear on this bit of software for some reason, so I'll be monitoring. Yeah, we've got Gavin on LinkedIn saying great guest. We've got morning guys from Andy Kent. So yeah, do get your questions in for Neil, or even just general thoughts on what we're talking about. So I mean, moving into very well positioned by what we've just discussed, really, Neil. But with Leonard Cheshire, so obviously it's one of the big charities. Everyone's heard of Leonard Cheshire. As of now, what are the services that are happening? Just for people that aren't familiar with the detail, could you just share a bit more of what Leonard Cheshire is doing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. So, I mean, if you go back to what the organisation's purpose is, so our purpose is to improve life choices with people, in individuals, and to play our part in building a fair and inclusive world. And the way that we do that, we talk about supporting individuals to live, learn, and work independently, whatever their ability. Now, because we are a very large geographically spread organisation, the translation of what that actually means to what we do and where and how we do it varies. But in essence, what we believe in is the full implementation of the UN Convention, and specifically Article 19, the right to independent living, Article 24, the right to equitable lifelong learning, and 27, the right to equality of employment. And those rights track through to our strands of live, learn, work. So here in the UK, we have a network of about 120 residential settings. So we have about 4,500 staff supporting just on 3,000 people with disabilities living in those residential settings. And that's in all 4 countries in the UK. And those settings vary enormously. At one end, we have some facilities for very, very high acuity individuals with a lot of intensive nursing needs, all the way through to modestly adapted flats in mainstream housing association developments. So that there's a very broad swathe of support that we provide. And so that's an anchor. That tends to be what most people know us for in the UK. However, outside of that activity in the UK, we've done a lot of work supporting younger individuals between 16 and 30 with a range of program support. So we have a thing called the Can Do program, where we've got about 3,000 participants in the Can Do program, which is sort of self-directed skills and development programs where people have the opportunity to do community work, acquire qualifications, build up social networks, that kind of thing. We also have a thing called the Opening Doors program, which is very much about opening up opportunities both for our residents and our program participants in the local community. And then we have our change program, or portfolio of programs, probably the best known of which is Change 100, which is a paid internship. The 100 refers to 100 days of paid internship. And that's really to support individuals make the transition, either as recent graduates or soon to be leaving tertiary education, to make that transition into the first job. I'm firmly of the view that the most difficult job ever to get is your first. And getting that breakthrough, simply because once you've done that, you've got something to talk to about your next job. So that's the UK. Internationally, we have a large number of education and employment programs. So we have regional centres in those places I mentioned before, and from there we run especially, I suppose, specialist international development programs where we support kids with disability get into mainstream education for the first time. We also support adults either into waged employment or to set up their own business. And I know you recently chatted to Josh Winterskill, who's one of our ambassadors and participated with the Stelios Awards that we do for disabled entrepreneurs. So we've got a huge range of activity, and then anchoring all of that, we have our policy and advocacy type work focused in the UN and the World Bank, and with the UK government. So hopefully there's people a flavour.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. And as you say, taking the United Nations Convention of Rights for Disabled People or Persons with Disability, and the three strands, and then all of your services fitting within that's really helpful way of framing it and understanding and remembering it. So I mean, as we're now in the Corona COVID-19 era, what's the impact been? I mean, I know you've mentioned on your social media a few times around the PPE equipment, which has been obviously a big deal around healthcare, NHS workers, and maybe some people don't fully understand what the need is around the social care side. And obviously you mentioned the services there. So we'll start there, but obviously, just be good to get your other thoughts and impacts on what we're going through at the moment.
Okay, well, I guess, when you lead a large, complicated organization like ours, you have lots and lots of responsibilities and lots of pulls on you as to where you put your people and your money in order to deliver the most outcomes. But at the end of the day, the single most important accountability for someone in my position is to keep people safe. And that's the people that we work with and the people who work for us. And I guess that has been the absolute overriding focus for us as we manage our response to COVID. Specifically, the 3,000 individuals who live with us, a number of those individuals have some very complex needs, some underlying health conditions, and are very much a high risk of the getting the virus and the implications of it. Yeah. So essentially, those 4,500 frontline staff, so our support workers, our social care workers, our nurses in some of our facilities, getting to a place that they are safe and the people that they are supporting are safe is been our overriding focus. And what that has entailed is since March the 23rd, restricting access into those facilities. Of those 4,500 staff, more than 1,000 have self-isolated for varying periods over the recent period. Of the nearly 3,000 residents, we've had more than 200 who have been symptomatic. And so the infection control, social distancing, PPE is obviously a massive thing for us. We've seen a huge challenge in getting the PPE to provide for our staff so that they can stay safe. And actually, that everyone's seen all over the news. It's a massive national issue. We've had to work incredibly hard to get access to stocks, to get it to people. and to keep replenishing them and to pay for it. You know, that's now costing us an extra £400,000 a month, and that's only going to go north. So, you know, the implications of how we keep our people safe have huge financial implications. So we're rattling through any cash reserves that we have in order to keep people safe, and of course that's what they're there for.
Yeah, and obviously the other side of, you know, even without that additional cost line that's so vital, as you've just described it, is that the fundraising side of all the charities has been hit as well in general, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're a little less exposed to that than some, given the nature of our economics. So basically, we're £150 million a year organisation. So in round numbers, £120 million of that are resident fees that are predominantly coming from CCGs or local authorities. Little bit of private pay, but the vast majority, 95% of that £120 million coming in the forms of fees. And then the remaining £30 million is what one would think of as more classically charitable activity. So for that £30 million, and you know, we've seen a huge hit to fundraising. You know, many in other organisations, you'll hear income down 60, 70, 80% pretty much overnight. We haven't been quite as bad as that, but we've been absolutely hammered by it. The bigger thing for us on the larger part of our organisation is the huge jump in additional costs, which I mentioned, the 400,000 a month in PPE and the 1,000 staff who self-isolated. That translates through into more recruitment, more agency, redeploying staff. So net, we're having to find somewhere between £1 and £2 million a month additional costs just to keep people safe. But what we have done on the fundraising side is we've redirected all of our fundraising around asking people to help us with the cost of PPE. So we've launched some fundraising efforts, and I'm glad to say that's starting to get a little bit of traction, but nowhere near yet enough to cover our costs. Can I just go back, Martin? I'm conscious I gave you some headline numbers about you know, a couple of hundred people living with us being symptomatic, and I should just say I'm delighted to say that about 130, 140 of those people have got over their symptoms and are back on the road to recovering from the virus. We do currently have about 60 or 70 residents who are currently symptomatic, and very, very sadly, we've had 12 people who live with us pass away.
Sorry to hear.
And of course, that's terribly difficult, just at an individual or a personal level. But it's very, very difficult for the staff whose working lives are supporting those individuals. Now, I'm pleased that some of the nightmare stories that one reads in the media about what's going on out there, we've managed to contain and get on top of, and that is not our experience. But nevertheless, you know, we're dealing with some profoundly challenging issues.
Yeah, there's that relativity, isn't there? That, you know, any death from COVID, indeed any death in general, is like you say, a personal level and an organizational level, very, very hard. But yeah, there are those absolute horror stories of residential care homes that have had it a hell of a lot worse. So that's, yeah, well done for keeping on top of it as well.
And we all feel it, don't we? I mean, you know, regardless of one's role, we're all in. I mean, I lost my godmother, sadly died 10 days ago from the virus, and so it's a very profound. There can't be a family out there who hasn't been affected in one way, shape, or another. And I think for people with disability at this point in time, it really brings to the fore many of the challenges and the vulnerabilities that some of us feel in day-to-day life, and it's really writ large to see that right across society. So we're all living through very difficult times.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got a sort of question to move us a step forward in a second, but just on that note of the fundraising, if anyone watching is wanting and able to support, where can they help donate to that fund?
I should be able to trot out the website, but you'll see it on a website on
on the main.
.org. There's a little 20-second vid with a click through to allow people both to text or donate on the website. And of course, that's for the public, but those people who are much closer to the Leonard Cheshire community, we've got a whole raft of work going on with our supporters and our volunteers, and our ambassadors and our corporate supporters. But essentially, the overriding focus for us is how on earth do we very, very quickly cover that £400,000 a month. And as I say, it's not going to stop there. I'll be surprised if that doesn't continue to escalate. We're getting through 50,000 masks a week, which is a sobering thought.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so really where we got to now is around, many people I've spoke to, they've had that personal, you sort of talked about the personal side of COVID-19, and there's obviously the fear, particularly those with particular health conditions, of contracting it. There's the fear of loved ones, and then there's just the stories of people in the broader circle we know to have passed away from it. But I have heard that sort of people, once they've adjusted to living with that fear in it, because in a way that's been part of the adjustment, is just that we take the precautions, but we sort of try and get on day to day. And then there's the organizational side of what needs to happen and change as well. But there are some sort of thoughts around medium to long term where there are benefits of sort of awareness of disability inclusion, or the adjustments that many disabled people need to live and work and learn, as you were saying earlier. Have you had, amongst the many fires that you've been putting out, but have you seen or heard of any thoughts in that area that you think there is cause for optimism in the longer term?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think I think we as a country, and we are as a world community, actually, I think we're at an inflection point. I think here in the UK, politically, the stability of the United Kingdom and the Union, I think is under question. I think economically, clearly, we've had all of the Brexit stuff, and we're all familiar with how technology is transforming all of our lives. For me, I think what this COVID experience does, it brings very, very sharply into focus, right at the highest levels of policymaking, some of the very profound choices about progressive social change in the future. And, I think we will emerge as a different world. We will emerge as a different country. And I think against that backdrop, the next 12, 24, 36 months, I think some incredibly important choices will be made. And one will see government pulling the levers of economic recovery in a way that is unprecedented and hasn't been done since the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. Yeah. I think if If, as that happens, this philosophy about building a truly inclusive economy can be properly embedded, but at the highest levels with the Prime Minister in Treasury, actually there is the chance, there is the opportunity for the decisions that are made around our recovery to really get at the fundamental root causes of some of the inequities in our society. So I've been struck by some of the slightly sort of gallows humour that one sees online from people with disabilities saying, well, you know, now the 65 million of you know a bit better what it's like to be one of the 13 million people with disability in terms of accessibility, in terms of isolation, in terms of remote working and transportation. And I think that's right. I think people who do not have lived experience are getting a very healthy dose in a focused way with some of those experiences. And I think it will change them, and I think it will change us. I think the challenge is to translate that potential into bold and radical realignment of some of the economic choices and the political priorities that we make about people in our society.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I guess there's a lot of questions around the how, and I mean that there's millions of ways, I suppose, of doing that. But is there something Leonard Cheshire and yourself are engaging with government at that level to work out the how?
Yeah, no, very much so. And we do that as one organisation, but I'm also co-chair of the Disability Charities Consortium. So that's a loose coalition of 10 charities. So Scope, Leonard Cheshire, Minds, MenCap, National Autistic Society, RNIB, Action on Hearing Loss, Sense, Business Disability Forum, and really, really importantly, Disability Rights UK. One of the things that attracted me to come to Leonard Cheshire, coming up 4 years ago, was this belief that a schism has grown up since the 90s between the disability charities and the DPO movement. And, you know, I think my observation from outside of the sector would be, you know, a lot of the disability charities were not sufficiently informed and led by either people with disability or that lived experience. Now, I think that is changing and has changed somewhat, but it needs to change a great deal more. You know, my colleague Cameron Mallock at Disability Rights UK, I think it's only he and I who were CEOs with lived experience in that group. And I've been pushing very, very hard, both within Leonard Cheshire and then within that group, for us to play our part in really healing some of that schism. I think we've made some progress, but I don't have any illusions as to how much further there is to go. But that my own personal experience, my disability rights background back in the 90s, and my core beliefs about what I think needs to happen around those levers. So you know, I've been engaging very heavily with colleagues in those organisations. I was talking to the minister yesterday, talking to the cabinet office disability unit on Tuesday at 5 o'clock today. We'll be talking again, and you know, that work is so profoundly important and has so far to go, but against the kind of fundamental shifts that are going on, I really do feel there is a moment in time, and it's probably only in 5 years' time that we'll be able to look back at it and to say, was the combination of leaders in the movement, in the disability charities, in government, in business, were they good enough to collectively seize the opportunities that exist to close that gap between legal rights and day-to-day experience. And I guess that's the task, and it's a task for all of us.
Yeah, agreed. When you're sort of chatting with the government, I've personal bugbear of mine has been the use of the word vulnerable. What are your thoughts on the word, and do you think any thought was given from government or whoever chose that word in the current context about the potential negative connotation of it?
You know, I mean, language is so profoundly important and so profoundly difficult, isn't it? So do I mean, you know, if I think about myself rather selfishly for a moment, and for many of the people I know, so many of the people who live with disability that I know, the last word I would ever think of using is vulnerable. You know, that's not how I think of myself. It's not how I think of many friends and colleagues, and it's not by observation how I think of so much of the community. I think at this point in society, however, I think it is sort of understandable, with the magnitude of some of the issues that people are wrestling with, that some policymakers default to that language. And I try to kind of cut them a break a little bit with that. And I know that's not, you know, that's not a universal view, and many people would disagree with me about that. But I suppose in understanding at the heart of government and at the heart of very large, complicated businesses, some of the real challenges in translating change and delivering it, not just at a policy level, but at a very direct service provision or end experience level, this is massively difficult. And I think their use of the word vulnerable was really about that, the shielding group around 1.5 million people. But you know, some friends of mine who who are blind and who have been doing online shopping for donkey's years are now in a situation that they're not in that group. And you know, the perverse situation is they can't get an online drop for 4 weeks. So what are they supposed to do? So they then bowl up to the supermarket, and there's been instances where you know, they've been excluded from access because they can't adhere to social distancing. You know, so there are some very, very profound challenges for government, and equally profound challenges for individuals. But that particular example, it was one that I used both with the Cabinet Office and with the Minister literally just yesterday. So what I try to do is to see it from both perspectives, and to use my opportunities, both as an individual and as an organizational leader, to influence progress. And that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I've been a lot more operating around media and marketing and trying to work with businesses on their sort of brand, and that's been more where my headspace has been. And I have had interactions over time, you know, in the past with the government, but for me, both of those areas, government and business, it just does come back to your point earlier about disabled people being in the room and sharing experiences. The way that you would create any policy or any product or service or marketing campaign, you always speak to the people that are going to consume or to vote for it or whatever. And I think that's what we're trying to fix and change, is that the solution's simple, but it is just frustrating that, you know, why didn't the government sit down with a group of people in the shielding group and say what would be an appropriate way within the bigger picture? We need society to adhere to social distancing, and we need that there are other factors. It's not just about disabled people, but within your community, what are the issues, but also what are the sort of wording that you would feel comfortable. And I just feel like they don't they don't do that. They just shoot from the hip, and then they have to clean up a lot of mess. So you see this and you get that, and I know it's all a journey, but it is, the answer is simply about having disabled people in the room with the decision makers.
I think that's right, but I think it's also about getting that diversity of opinion. You know, so I think good policy making or good brand development is fundamentally about the customer is king, and
Yeah.
you know, smart businesses who understand their customer base are completely directed by it. You know, if I go back to my business career, you know, one of the most influential periods in my career was I joined what was Cellnet in 1996, and when I joined, we had 1,500 staff and 1.8 million customers. And when I left 8 years later, I left what had become O2. There were 15,000 staff and 15 million customers. Now, you know, a lot of that's a little bit about luck and timing, but an awful lot of it's about skill as well. And part of the skill of my boss there, who was the chief executive through that period, was he completely rooted all of the organization's activity in the customer, and it's that gave insight, and that insight drove action, and that action drove success, and it drove better customer experience.
Exactly.
And that cycle is hugely important, and that's the cycle that government needs to get to, and they're substantially further back on it. The potential is massively greater, but also the obstacles and the levers are massively greater. I feel that there is in government there is a growing understanding of that reality. How many times have you heard ministers say, we're going to take advice from the experts in the last 8 weeks? Well, you weren't hearing that a couple of years ago. So I feel, you know, with DRUK and some other DPO colleagues, you know, that side of things is beginning to improve. It's wholly inadequate. I'm not sat here saying this is magically fixed thing, but I genuinely feel that there is a change now. Whether we can accelerate it and make the most of the advantages and minimize the disadvantages to make the most difference, that's our collective challenge. But I do think if you're a policy maker who is, you know, looking to do the right thing in the way that you describe, the fragmentation of the movement, the fragmentation of charities is hugely confusing. And
that's true.
And I think we give them a free pass by not being united.
Yeah, I totally wholeheartedly agree with that, and that's been ever since I've been in this space, is constantly how to unite the community. And as you say, that's the litmus test, isn't it? In 5 years, did we manage to unite the community, and did the leaders in government and business, you know, carry through the promises of hearing our insights and delivering them?
And I think, you know, one of the things that attracted me to Leonard Cheshire, because, you know, I've been an observer for the last 25 years and a participant on some of these, you know, the progress that we spoke about earlier. But if you look at the organizations and the dynamics to really unlock fundamental change, I was hugely frustrated at the lack of cut through, that collectively through the austerity years, somehow I felt that the government, all the charity sectors across the field of disability, and the movement were collectively underperforming. We weren't getting disability at the right level of focus from policymakers. And I think we have to have the courage to embrace that part of the reason for that will be us and our collective challenges in speaking with a united voice, using the same language, expressing the same priorities. And I think when I look at some of the fabulous work that Mind and Heads Together have done around the whole mental health agenda in the last 10 years, I think there's a model there. That's translated into, an extra $2.5 billion a year investment into mental health services. And I know we've got masses way to go, but, the Prince is getting involved in that stuff. It feels like in the last 10 years, that whole agenda has moved forward. And I think there are quite instructive lessons for the wider disability community to learn from that, about how you get traction and how you do what we all want to do. But, when I looked at Leonard Cheshire from the outside, I was amazed at how its international work and how its UK work was so different. So, our director of policy is currently seconded to run the secretariat to the UN on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Our international model is steeped in, the convention, which talks about being led, directed, and governed by people with disability. We're one of 3 technical advisors to the World Bank on disability. Our delivery model is absolutely fundamentally dependent on our partnership with DPOs in the Global South. So, a big part of our activity is about building DPO capacity and channeling funding to get resources to the front line. And that is what has fueled our growth from 4 years ago. We were reaching probably 15 to 20,000 people, and today we're reaching 60,000 people. So one of my challenges is, how do I take the learnings and the strengths of that approach within Leonard Cheshire and see it replicated in a much, much deeper systemic way here in the UK? And you mentioned the word journey. We've made a lot of progress on that in the last 3 years, but we have a huge, huge distance still to travel.
Yeah, agreed. We've got a few comments and questions coming in. The first one I'm going to go to is Julie has written about 4 times on LinkedIn, and then she was getting worried that she wasn't going to get a question, so she moved to Twitter and has been asking her question there as well. Sure. It does link into some of what you've said, but it's also around BAME communities within the DPO sector. And so I think it's like, do you work with DPO BAMEs, or is there a general thought process around how to include other minority groups with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, what we try to adopt a philosophy of complete diversity and inclusion. So, by definition, a lot of the DPOs that we work with in the Global South are highly focused on what we would think of as BME. I think here in the UK, our programs, I mentioned that in the last few years, our UK programs for young people have increased a great deal. We've gone from having about 4,000 young people to about 12,000. So, and it's quite interesting that when one looks at the underlying demographics of that, our program participants over-index in terms of ethnicity and minorities, which is great. Which kind of gives us a sort of sense that we are doing a reasonable job in recognizing the diversity of all potential groups in our society. I think we've also been doing a bit of work with the with some other organisations in the BAME space about how we can come together with them and people like the Institute of Fundraising and to really put disability and BAME and sexuality at the heart of how the charity sector modernizes and becomes more representative. So, you know, we jointly were working on can we get a 5-year program together with some lottery funding with exactly those outcomes, where we would effectively do a specialist version of our Change 100 program around paid internship to get people more evenly represented through into employment. So I don't know if that answers Julie's question, but that there's a number of examples of how we think about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And then in terms of, I mean, a lot of the comments are just sort of in agreeing and talking about the word vulnerable, and you know, the sort of, it's probably not the right word to use synonymously with disabled people, but as you mentioned earlier, obviously, you know, it wasn't intended as disabled people under the Equalities Act. It was the 1.5 million that are, I would probably say, more susceptible rather than vulnerable.
And listen, Martin, I think what we also have to acknowledge is that there are many people with disability, it might not be you and I, who would use that language. And so, you know, as I've gone around some of our services before we went into lockdown and talking to residents, you know, and participants in our programs, they would describe feeling anxious, they would describe feeling fear, they would describe feeling isolation, and many of them would say, you know, I feel vulnerable.
Vulnerable, yeah.
You know, so while those of us who were perhaps more focused on the rights agenda and the policy agenda and the implications of some of that language, try to be quite disciplined about the lexicon. We don't always manage it, but we try. We also have to acknowledge that for policymakers who are being encouraged to engage with a huge diversity of opinion for people with disability, when they do, and other people with disability, in the way that some of our participants and residents verbalize it to me, verbalize and use that language with them, they could be forgiven for getting a bit mixed up.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Cool. Well, we're pretty much at the end of our chat, Neil. Julie agrees. So we've got the feedback there that your answer on that was satisfactory. So thank you again from Julie. I mean, really, just to finish off, I think what would your galvanizing words be to disabled people tuning in here about how to get involved and help to steer this to a better place going forward?
I think someone tweeted something recently that really stuck in the back of my mind, and I've used it with colleagues here, and it was just a simple mechanic where having the humility to listen, the wisdom to learn, and the courage to change. Those sentiments are what we are asking of politicians, policymakers, business people. And I think if they're good enough for them, they're probably good enough for us as well.
That's a perfect way to end it. Listen, thank you so much for your time. I've always enjoyed having a good old chinwag about it. And I know there are some big challenges specifically in around the PPE that you're navigating. So good luck with those short-term concerns, and hopefully some of the people watching can help get involved with those efforts to solve it. But also, you know, thank you for taking a leadership approach that's looking to unite the community, and I'm excited to work more with you in the future as well.
Okay, well listen, Mike, it's a pleasure to talk to you as always. Appreciate the opportunity to chat through some of these things. To anyone who wants to get involved and help, of course, we're always extremely grateful. But by far the most important thing is just for people to stay safe and wish everyone who's dealing with all of their version of the challenges every good wish for the coming weeks and months. So thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And everyone, thanks for tuning in and watching today. Obviously, if you're watching the replay, hope you've enjoyed it. And if you've got questions through watching on the replay, where's the best place for people to comment or contact you on social media, Neil?
I'm on Twitter. I'm not as great at keeping on top of it because there's so much to do. But either that, or yeah. I'm always happy to, my email address is easily accessible. neil.heslop@leonardcheshire.org. I always reply to or try to reply to absolutely everything. I get deluged with about 500 a day, so sometimes it takes me a while. But if people do want to reach out, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, or drop me an email.
Brilliant. Well, cool. And tomorrow I've got Toby Milden, who's a good friend of mine, but he's working in big businesses around inclusion practices and policy. So we'll be digging a bit deeper with Toby on that tomorrow. And then, of course, it's the end of another week. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you again, Neil, and bye-bye for now.